Welcome to the Big Four Accounting Firms podcast, brought to you by big4accountingfirms.com and the Big Four Accounting Firms YouTube channel. Before we get started, just wanted to remind everybody to support us if you have a chance or if you can. Even $1 helps, and we have a link in the description to a website called Buy Me a Coffee. It's just a way to donate to us and support us. Again, any amount is helpful so that we can keep putting out content. And there's also other ways for you to support us in the show notes to this podcast or on YouTube in the description.
In today's podcast, we're going to discuss news that KPMG is being sued in Malaysia for $5.6 billion in damages. And they're looking for that from about 44 current and former partners in relation to KPMG's audit of 1MDB's financial statements between 2010 to 2012. And 1MDB is One Malaysia Development Berhad. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. And this comes from a series of lawsuits. I'm reading an article from Reuters. And 1MDB was co-founded by the former Prime Minister, Najib Razak, and he did have to pay some money, or I don't know if he paid it, but he was found guilty of corruption and money laundering, and he denies that he did anything wrong. He's appealing the verdict. And this is 5.6 billion US, I believe, that there's actually trying to recover. And this is a pretty big thing. And it says that Deloitte has already paid $80 million to the Malaysian government because of claims related to their dealings with 1MDB. And 1MDB, Deloitte took over after KPMG stopped auditing 1MDB. And I think there's a lot of other companies too that have settled, because I've seen this story about this fund out of Malaysia in multiple places. And I think KPMG is just the latest to get pulled into it. And according to the lawsuit, the plaintiffs allege that $3.2 billion was misappropriated during the period where KPMG served as the auditor. And they say that the losses from 2009 to 2014 could have been avoided if KPMG obtained sufficient evidence to support its audit findings. And I think this is a huge problem in auditing that big four accounting firms face. I mean, luckily they never have to pay out like really huge amounts. They always settle for millions, and they typically have insurance to cover that. And if not, then they settle for a smaller amount, because it doesn't really make sense for what appears to be a 2 or 3 year audit to put KPMG on the hook for $5.6 billion. I think people need to have a basic understanding of what an audit is. But I think also the big four accounting firms need to be more rigorous around cash. They don't need to be looking into a whole bunch of accounting principles and stuff. They just need to audit cash, and they need to have stricter procedures around cash and how they support cash and how they provide that to regulators and everything. Because at the end of the day, you have to make sure the cash is there. Who cares what fancy accounting principles are being utilized? If there's fraud going on, it's because somebody's moving cash into their own account or doing some kind of thing, because they say it's siphoned. Well, I mean, I'm sure KPMG did enough to paper their audit file with whatever sampling they did, but I doubt they really looked very rigorously into cash. But I guess back to my earlier point that I don't think that auditing firms should be on the hook for billions of dollars. That's just ridiculous. You're never going to have an audit again in the world if you're constantly going back to the auditors to hold them liable. I mean, KPMG always gets tied up in these really bad ones. I'm not sure how they always do, but I think it's just luck of the draw. I think it's just part of being at the lower end of the big four accounting firms, and you get the lower end clients. Obviously, the big four accounting firms need to be more rigorous around the clients that they take on, and I think a lot of this stuff can also be headed off by, I would say headed off by not accepting shady financial services companies like asset managers that just started up especially when they involve politicians, because we've seen this before. I think it was in South Africa where a politician was accused of scamming the country out of money. And so I think the big four accounting firms have to be a little bit more careful. They have to do more procedures around cash, because there's obviously just nothing being done if these people are just fleecing billions of dollars. To me, that's pretty obvious that you just did not look at it all, or you just looked at a cover page of something. That something more needs to be done, and then I don't know. It's tough to say because this keeps on happening. But again, I don't think they should be on the hook for $5.6 billion for 3 years. People need to understand the basics, but we see this happening. It's increasing risk across the board. Big four accounting firms are already regulated to death. And if you work in the big four accounting firms, you know this because you have to take 5 million trainings and onboarding about all these procedures of onboarding a client, making sure you're independent. And that's just because of all these types of things that go on after the year. So over the years. So I think it's if the big four accounting firms need to get better at this, but also the regulators too. Like regulators, you can't just add more regulators to the mix. The auditors need to do better and the regulators need to do better because they're all missing stuff. There's no perfect way to do this. You learn in accounting, like you can't find all fraud and corruption, especially when there's collusion. But there's more that needs to get done because I agree that things would have been done if KPMG actually audits sufficiently. But that doesn't mean that they could have prevented. That doesn't mean they should be on the hook for $5.6 billion in damages. I'm sure that there was some kind of collusion going on here. So at the end of the day, I think it's just another crazy case. But at some point, there's a potential for another Arthur Andersen here of a big four accounting firm getting put out of business, especially if they have to pay huge fines like this. And it sets a precedent because if they have to pay one of these huge fines in one of these countries, then that has a potential to cascade across the world, especially in the stricter countries like Europe or Australia. There's these things could cascade, and regulators could really shut down the big four accounting firms if they wanted to. I mean, that's where the big four accounting firms have to be careful, where they partner up with government too much, because at the end of the day, if they let the governments get too big and cozy next to them, then they could just be okay putting them out of business or splitting them up. But I'm sure what'll come out of this is, for the average big four accountant, is just more training, more steps in the process of onboarding a client, more training, just more admin, and that's what always happens after this, especially at KPMG. KPMG already has a lot of procedures they have to do because of all the things that have happened to them over the year, and I'm sure this will most likely only add to it, especially when there's an international portion of a client. And international, I mean like outside of the U.S. That if there's that piece, then there's just going to be more admin that needs to get done. So that's the podcast for today. Make sure to subscribe to this podcast to stay up to date on all things big four accounting firms. And if you can, support us financially through the Buy Me a Coffee link in the show notes of this podcast. And thanks for listening.